Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Abyssos the 8th Circle Savage, Part 1. This video will cover the first encounter up to the checkpoint. If you're looking for Part 2, check the link in the description below. My name is Ms. Tech and I'll be your raid guide. The lines on the platform, both the thick white lines and the thinner black lines, are essential in handling specific mechanics throughout this encounter. Familiarizing yourself with these lines will help you in progressing mechanics, so use them to your advantage. I would also recommend tanking the boss as close to the center of the arena during the few times when he can be moved. The encounter begins with Genesis of Flame, which will deal massive raid-wide damage. Use raid cooldowns, shields, and heals. The boss will then cast Conceptual Octaflare or Tetraflare. Throughout this encounter, any cast with Conceptual in front of it will not go off right away, and instead be stored for later. Furthermore, Octaflare indicates an attack that will target all 8 players for high damage that cannot be overlapped. Players will need to spread apart to avoid death. Tetraflare indicates an attack that will target 4 players for high damage that must be shared with another player to survive. You'll need to pair up one support player with one damage dealer and assign them rough locations to stack up during this attack. Players will have to identify which attack is being cast and keep it in their minds for now. Next up, the boss will cast volcanic torches and 4 bright blue lines will begin to appear, making their way over the thick white lines on the platform until they each complete a 4x1 rectangle. These areas will explode for massive damage and debuffs and should be avoided. A quick way to determine the safe tiles on the platform is to break down the entire platform into 4 quadrants, each containing 4 tiles. Since players are already loosely assigned to these quadrants to handle future Tetraflares, they only need to look at the 4 tiles in their quadrant once the volcanic torch lines begin to move. There will always be one safe tile in each quadrant, no matter what the volcanic torch pattern is. Let me give you an idea of how I personally approach this mechanic. I like to position myself in the middle of my quadrant, turning my camera in such a way that I can easily see the 2 volcanic torches that will soon move into my area. As soon as the lines make their first directional change, I'll know exactly which way the death rectangles are forming, allowing me to eliminate the unsafe tiles once I recognize this. As soon as I figure out where the safe tile is, I move into it to prepare for the next 2 overlapping mechanics. The boss will then cast Sunforge and the snake or phoenix will appear around him. If you see the snake, the attack will occur directly through the boss and across the platform from north to south. The limit of this attack will be the thin black lines on the east and west sides. If you see the phoenix, the attack will essentially be the opposite of the snake, with the attacks targeting the east and west sides of the boss. The thin black lines will again act as the limit of these attacks just from the other direction. As soon as the Sunforge animal is identified, all players will need to adjust onto the correct side of the thin black lines within their safe tiles to avoid this attack. If their safe tile happens to be in an area that is not safe from the incoming animal attack, players will need to be ready to immediately adjust in or out after the volcanic torches explode, as there is a moment before Sunforge actually goes off. Furthermore, the original stored Conceptual Flare attack will resolve at the exact same time as the Sunforge attack. As players adjust in or out for the snake or phoenix, they will also need to ensure that they are stacked for Tetraflare or spread far enough apart for Octaflare. Again, having player pairs assigned to each quadrant will ensure everyone is sufficiently spread in advance to handle any possible variant of these mechanics without killing each other. Next up, the boss will cast Flame Viper. This is a 2-part heavy-hitting line tank buster in the direction of the primary target that will place a magic vulnerability up debuff and a 15-second bleed on anyone hit. This tank buster absolutely requires a tank swap, as the bleed debuff will deal lethal damage if stacked on one player, and no immunity will last long enough for the tank to survive. As such, the second tank will need to provoke during the cast, and each tank will need to appropriately mitigate each hit of the tank buster to minimize the initial hit and the resultant bleed damage. Healers keep an eye on tank health during this time, as even with proper mitigation, this bleed is pretty spicy. Next up, the boss will teleport to the middle of the arena and begin to cast REFORGED Reflection. This marks the beginning of a self-contained mini-phase that will be determined by which animal he transforms into. This first mini-phase will also determine the order of the rest of the encounter. If he floats into the air, the chains around his legs break and he transforms into a weird centaur beast, all players will need to either stand near the center with their backs to a corner or immediately use a knockback immunity. The boss will jump into the center of the arena, knocking back all players a set distance. He will then begin to cast Rearing Rampage, which will throw out 4 rounds of attacks that will each target 2 random players with these massive earth attacks. These attacks will deal raid-wide damage and apply 12-second earth resistance down 2 debuffs on targeted players, meaning that they cannot get hit by more than 1 round. To handle this, all players will spread around the boss before the cast goes off. ensuring they are far enough away from each other to avoid overlap. Additionally, each round of players hit will need to remember the order that they were targeted in, as this will come into play with the next mechanic. The boss will then cast Stomp Dead, jumping on the furthest player from him, dealing massive shareable damage in a wide circle around them, and applying a physical vulnerability up debuff on anyone hit. The boss will do this jump attack a total of 4 times before the mini phase ends. The original order of rearing rampage attacks and the resultant debuff timers come into play here. The 2 players that were first targeted by rearing rampage will need to be the first 2 players hit by Stomp Dead, as they'll be the only 2 players without active debuffs when this attack begins. The players that were hit second will then position themselves to bait the second jump, and so on until all 4 player groups bait each jump attack. To do this, we use the inner thick white lines on the platform as guidance, specifically the northwest, north, and center intersections. This positioning will ensure all players can maintain uptime during all of the boss jumping. It also saves the tanks from having to move the boss back to the center after the mini phase, as his last jump will bring him back into the center. As soon as the last rearing rampage attack goes off and all players have identified which order of attack they are, the first set of players will stand on the northwest corner, while the second set stands in the center. The third and fourth rounds of players will both stand on the line in the north to wait their turn. The boss will jump to the northwest to target the first group. As soon as he does, Group 1 can move to the waiting area in the north, while Group 3 runs into the northwest to bait. The boss will then jump onto Group 2 in the center. As soon as he does, Group 2 can then move into the north waiting area, while Group 4 moves into the center. The boss will then leap onto Group 3 in the northwest again, before turning back to jump on Group 4 in the center. Players waiting in the north must make sure that they don't move past their white line to ensure they're never further than the players baiting the jumps. After the 4th and final jump, the boss will return to normal and the mini phase ends. Before we move on, let's look at the second mini phase possibility. After he casts Reforged Reflection, if he raises his arm up, the chains around his arm break and his arm turns into a giant snake. All players must immediately move out of his hitbox. He will swipe the area around him, killing any player caught inside of the hitbox. The boss will then cast GORGON, and all players will be afflicted by 2 debuffs based on their role groups. All players of a role group will be marked by either first in line or second in line debuffs. This numbered debuff simply acts as an indicator of which incoming round of snakes these players will resolve their other debuffs in. 2 players in each role group will be afflicted by orange Eye of the Gorgon debuffs, while the other 2 are afflicted by green Blood of the Gorgon debuffs. The Eye of the Gorgon will cause the player to shoot out a conal gaze attack directly in front of them, petrifying anyone and anything hit. The Blood of the Gorgon will cause large circle attacks to target the player, dealing high damage to anything it hits. With the timing of these debuffs, each round of debuffs will always have the 2 Eye of the Gorgon players resolving first, while the Blood of the Gorgon players resolve second. The boss will then cast Into the Shadows and pound on the ground. This will spawn 2 Gorgons that will move around the platform before erupting from the ground on the white lines at either the cardinal or intercardinal points. The position of these Gorgons is indicated by the gaze markers moving around the platform, and they can spawn at either 90 or 180 degree angles to one another. As the markers circle around the platform, they'll move slightly outwards before settling into their final spots. As they do this, all players will need to position their characters to avoid looking at them, as their gaze attacks will go off once they appear above ground. An easy way to do this is to circle around the boss, keeping the markers behind you until they settle, allowing you to continue attacking the boss without interruption. If the Gorgons are at 180 degrees to each other, you can stand to face the point directly between the 2 of them to avoid getting hit. Getting hit by the Gorgon gaze attack will petrify the player, essentially causing a wipe, as they won't be able to properly resolve their debuffs before they regain control over their character. As such, it is absolutely imperative that all players position themselves appropriately to avoid each initial gaze attack when the Gorgons appear. As soon as the first set of Gorgons appear, the markers of the second set will appear and begin to rotate around the platform. The second set of Gorgons will always appear at the 2 points opposite the initial set. At this time, the players with the first in line debuffs will need to handle the first round of Gorgons. The 2 players with Eye of the Gorgon will each need to position themselves to breathe on top of a Gorgon, freezing it in place. Immediately after, the 2 Blood of the Gorgon players will need to stand next to their Gorgon to hit it with their circle attack, destroying the Gorgon in the process. If a Gorgon is not frozen or destroyed, it will eventually cast and wipe the group. To avoid confusion here, we assign a clockwise priority for each player in each role group so that everyone knows in advance which Gorgon they'll need to deal with, regardless of where where they appear. Depending on how the initial debuffs apply, 2 players in each role group will also need to be assigned to swap their clockwise priority if necessary. As the first round of Blood of the Gorgon players are running to their Gorgons to destroy them with their attacks, the second round of Gorgons will appear on the platform, and all players will need to ensure they're not facing these 2 spawn points to avoid their gaze attacks. At this point, the second in line players will need to begin resolving their debuffs on the remaining 2 Gorgons in the same fashion as the first group. The 2 eye debuff players will freeze their assigned Gorgons first, and then the 2 blood debuff players will destroy them with their attacks. The blood attacks will deal very high damage to affected players, so healers will need to pay close attention to HP during this time and shield in advance. Once the final set of Gorgons is destroyed, the boss will cast Ectothermos, dealing high raid-wide damage, shield and heal as necessary. This marks the end of the snake mini-phase, and the boss will return to his original form. Next up, the boss will cast Illusory Creation, spawning 4 clones at the edge of the platform on each cardinal point. He'll then cast Creation on command, and 2 adjacent clones will each spawn a snake or a phoenix and begin to cast Sunforge. This will form one of 2 possible safe spot patterns, with safe spots north and south, or east and west. An easy way to identify this is to find the clone with the phoenix, and align yourself with that clone within the thin black lines. The boss will then cast Manifold Flames, which will target all 4 players of a random role group with wide AoE circle attacks, and then a short moment after will target the 4 closest players with line attacks. The first set of circle attacks and the clone Sunforges will go off at the exact same time. To handle this, we have players move into the safe zone that is closest to their original assigned quadrant. This will ensure that only 4 players will move into each safe zone. Once there, all melee players will stand in the safe corners close to the boss, while the ranged players move to the outer corners of the safe spot. In these assigned spread positions, players targeted by the first set of Manifold Flame attacks will not overlap with anyone else. This first part of the attack will place a 6-second magic vulnerability up debuff on them, meaning the role group that did not get targeted first will need to bait the second part of the attack. To do this, as soon as the Sunforge and circle attacks go off, the players in the role group that did not get hit will immediately move into the boss's hitbox, standing at the intercardinals to bait the line attacks away from each other. The players of the role group that was initially targeted will stand at max melee at the cardinals. As players resolve the final hit of Manifold Flame, the remaining 2 clones will both spawn snakes or phoenixes and cast Sunforge. If they've spawned snakes, all players will have to move out of the center and into their assigned corners, again using the thin black lines as reference. If they've spawned phoenixes, all players will need to move into the direct center, in the area within the thin black lines. The boss will then cast Tetraflare or Nest of Vipers. If it's Tetraflare, player pairs will have to stack together in their assigned corners. If it's Nest of Vipers, all players will need to spread apart to avoid overlap. This movement will have to be done within the confines of the Sunforge safe spots, as these attacks will go off at the exact same time. Immediately after, another round of volcanic torchlights will appear and begin to move around the platform. This time, 6 lines will appear, and only 1 corner tile will be safe once they complete their paths. Once the lines make their first turn, you'll be able to identify the safe corner tile, giving you plenty of time to move into it before the rest of the platform explodes. The boss will then cast Genesis of Flame again. Remember to mitigate, shield, and heal as necessary. Soon after, the boss will teleport into the center of the arena and cast a second Reforged Reflection, marking the beginning of the second mini-phase. This mini-phase will always be the opposite of the first mini-phase. For example, if Snake was first, the second mini-phase will always be Beast, and vice versa. Once the second mini-phase is complete and the boss returns to his normal form, he'll cast another conceptual Tetraflare or Octaflare. This flare attack will not go off until the very end of the next combo of mechanics, so make sure you internalize whether it's a stack or spread, and keep it in mind for now. The boss will then cast fourfold fires, and 4 proximity-based damage markers will appear in each corner. All players will need to stand in the center of the arena to minimize damage. Shield and heal through this damage as necessary. 4 fire vents will appear in each corner, and the boss will begin to cast Chthonic Vent. At the end of this cast, 2 vents will begin to bubble violently. Players will need to move away from these vents as they will soon explode in massive circle attacks. Once they do, fire snakes will appear out of them and fly into another 2 vents, eventually causing them to explode as well. During the second vent explosion, the boss will also be casting Octaflare or Tetraflare, and players will need to stack or spread within the available safe zones away from the vent explosions as necessary. If the vent safe zones happen to be diagonal to each other, the raid will need to split into 2 to ensure enough room for each player to deal with a stack or spread at the same time. The snakes will again fly to another set of vents for a final round of vent explosions, and players will have to adjust into the new safe areas. As the final vent explosions go off, the boss will cast Sunforge, and players will need to quickly quickly identify if it's the Snake or Phoenix attack before adjusting appropriately. The initial stored Octo or Tetra Flare will go off immediately after, and players will need to stack or spread near their assigned corners in the appropriate safe spots to handle the combo of attacks. This is immediately followed by another Flame Viper double tank buster, tank swap, and cooldown as necessary. Next up, the boss will cast Reforged Reflection a third time. This will mark the beginning of the second Snake or Beast mini phases, this time with new but similar mechanics. The third mini phase will always be the same type as the first, so if Beast was first, this third mini phase will also be Beast, and vice versa. The Beast 2 mini phase will begin in the exact same manner as the first, with the boss jumping up in the air to transform before slamming onto the platform and knocking back all players. Stand in the center with your back to a corner or use the knockback immunity. The boss will then turn to face north or south and cast Quadrupedal Impact or Quadrupedal Crush. Impact will knock back all players from that cardinal, and players should pre-position in that area to avoid getting knocked into the wall. Crush will form a massive circle attack on the cardinal, and players will need to pre-position on the opposite cardinal to avoid getting hit. The boss will then cast Conceptual Tetra Flare or Die Flare, which will be stored for a short while. Tetra Flare is the same partner stack mechanic, while Die Flare will target both healers for massive shareable damage. The raid will need to split into light parties and stack with their assigned healer to share the incoming damage. Next, the boss will cast Blazing Footfalls, and a sequence of 4 markers will appear on the platform, indicating the order of attacks players can expect once the cast goes off. This sequence will always start with a linear knockback attack through the center from north to south. The width of the lethal area of this attack is again identical to the thin black markers on the platform, and players can use these as reference of where to stand to avoid getting hit or knocked into the wall. The second indicator will either be an impact knockback marker or a massive circle crush marker on the east or west. The third indicator is always another linear knockback marker, this time covering from east to west. The final indicator will be an impact knockback marker or a circle crush marker in the north or south, the opposite of what the second attack was. The stored Conceptual Tetra Flare or Die Flare will also go off at the same time that the Blazing Footfalls cast goes off, and players will need to be in their appropriate partner or group stacks as the first linear knockback occurs to avoid death. They'll then need to adjust for the next 3 attacks based on the original order of indicators. As they do this, 3 volcanic torch lines will appear and begin their progress around the arena. This pattern of torches will always form a safe single 4x1 tile section in the far east or west. The unsafe platform tiles will explode at the end of the sequence of attacks as the boss is returning to his original form. This may seem super confusing at first, especially if you have a terrible memory like me, but once we break it down, it's not too bad. Since we know the first attack is always a linear knockback through the north and south, the first movement will always be to move to the appropriate thin black line on the east or west, while also pairing up with your partner or stacking with your assigned group. Determining which way to go depends on the second marker indicator. If it's a circle crush marker, players will want to stand on the opposite side of the indicator to get knocked away from the incoming crush attack. If it's a knockback impact marker, players will want to stand on the same side as the indicator to get knocked towards the area where they will need to pre-position for the next knockback. After the first knockback, players will pause for a moment while the Tetra Flare and Die Flare resolves. Once it does, they can reposition on the edge of the platform in the center as the second attack goes off. If it's a crush attack on the other side, players can stay on the edge to avoid it. If it's an impact knockback, players can move slightly left or right off of the center in preparation for the knockback to push them into the direction of their next dodge. Again, since the third attack is always a linear knockback that will come from east to west, players will want to move towards the area that will have them getting knocked to the side that will be safe from the final impact or crush attack. If players are expecting an impact, they'll want to get knocked towards the indicator of the final attack. If players are expecting a crush, they'll want to get knocked away from the indicator of that final attack. Again, for the linear knockback, use the thin black lines as your reference point for safety. As long as you're on the outside of it, you'll be fine. After the third attack knockback, players can wait for the final attack to resolve. If it's a crush, players can immediately start moving east or west to the safe volcanic torch tiles, making sure they don't move in too early to get clipped. If it's impact, players will wait on the edge and position themselves slightly east or west towards the safe spot to get knocked into that direction. You'll have a few seconds after the final attack to move into the safe zone if necessary. At this point, the boss will return to his original form and the Beast 2 mini-phase ends. However, before we continue, let's look at the Snake 2 possible mini-phase. Again, at the end of the Reforged Reflection cast, all players will need to move out of his hitbox to avoid getting swiped to death. The boss will cast Gorgon again, and all players will be afflicted with Eye and Blood of the Gorgon debuffs at either 22 or 28 seconds, the timers of which are role-based. 2 players in one role group will also be afflicted by extra Breath of the Gorgon debuffs, and 2 players in the other role group will be afflicted by extra Crown of the Gorgon debuffs, both of them on a 38-second timer. The short timers of each debuff essentially break down to all players in one role group always freezing Gorgons first, while the other role group drops their AoE circle attacks in a safe spot. Each role group will then switch responsibilities to resolve their longer debuffs. The boss will cast Into the Shadows, this time spawning 4 Gorgons at once. These Gorgons will travel around the room, their locations indicated by the same gaze markers. If the markers begin circling counterclockwise, the Gorgons will appear at the intercardinal points. If the markers are rotating clockwise, the Gorgons will appear at the cardinal points. At the same time, 4 clones will appear in each corner and blast directly in front of them, essentially reducing the usable platform space to just the center 4 tiles. To handle this, we assign a damage dealer with 1 support player, and assign each pair to handle a cardinal and intercardinal point. Our waymarkers are set up in such a way that we can color coordinate, and assign each pair to a specific color of waymarkers. As the Gorgons settle into their spawn points, all players will need to look outside the arena while positioning at the cardinal or intercardinal points opposite the Gorgon spawns to avoid getting hit by the gaze attacks. The role group with the shorter eye debuff will then freeze their assigned Gorgon by moving to it and looking out at it. The role group with the short blood debuffs will stay at the intercardinal or cardinal points they started on to drop their blood attacks away from others. The clone attacks on the outer tiles will occur at the same time here, so make sure you're resolving this first round of debuffs within the 4 center tiles. Once the first round of debuffs go off, player pairs will switch positions. The long eye debuff will freeze their assigned Gorgon once again, while the long blood debuff will stand in between them to drop their puddle. The boss will be casting Illusory Creation during this time, and a single clone will appear on a random edge to target the area directly in front of him for a massive line attack. This clone will always spawn to target and hit 2 of the 4 Gorgons, destroying them in the process, and players will need to identify which 2 Gorgons will be left over. These leftover Gorgons will be used to resolve the final set of debuffs. The players with Crown of the Gorgon debuff will throw out massive gaze attacks that cannot be avoided unless you're hiding behind a frozen Gorgon. The players with the Breath of the Gorgon debuffs will need to stand close to each Gorgon to destroy it with their attacks. This attack deals massive damage, and the raid will need to be split in 2 to share the incoming damage. To handle this, once the 2 leftover Gorgons are identified, the groups will split in 2 and run to their assigned Gorgons. Again, we have a clockwise priority system with assigned player swaps based on debuff applications to ensure everyone knows where they're going no matter what 2 Gorgons are left over. Once again, we use the thick white lines for safety guidance. The players debuffed with Breath of the Gorgon and all unafflicted players will stand on the white line in front of the Gorgon. The players with the Crown debuffs will stand on the white line behind their Gorgon. This ensures that nobody other than the 2 Gorgons are getting hit by either Shriek, and that the 2 groups are stacked to share the blood damage while destroying the frozen Gorgons. Once the remaining 2 Gorgons are destroyed, the boss will return to his original form, marking the end of Snake 2 mini-phase. At this point, the boss will teleport back to the center and cast another Flame Viper. If you're not a tank, make sure to move away from the front as necessary. Tank swap and cooldown through both hits. Healers keep an eye on those tank bleeds. The boss will then cast his final REFORGED Reflection. Again, this mini-phase will be the second beast or snake phase that hasn't been seen yet. After the end of the second mini-phase, the boss will cast another Genesis of Flame. You'll have a short amount of time to bring his health below 50% before he becomes invulnerable and casts his final Genesis of Flame and Rage. If you succeed, you'll enter a cutscene and get transported to the final phase. If you don't, you'll need to restart and try again. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll head into the second part of the 8th Circle Savage. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.